Well, hey, we are in the last week of this series on Samuel. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we have seen the rise and the fall of many people. Whether that is the priest Eli falling, or Samuel's rise, or maybe even King Saul, the first king, his rise to kingship, but then his epic fail. And then we've seen David rise, but last week, as Pastor Josh was sharing, David had his issues too. And as we go on this journey, it kind of is a little bit of a look into our life, because some of us have had, some pretty major character defects in our own life. And to know that God can still use us, but we have to be careful along this journey. I was looking into Dietrich Bonhoeffer a little bit this week, and I heard this quote, and it kind of stuck with me, especially in light of what we're talking about here in Samuel, but also in the coming weeks as we journey through the Kings. And he said, and this was in response really to Adolf Hitler rising to power in Germany, where he was at. He said, "Should the leader allow himself to succumb to the wishes of those he leads, who will always seek to turn himself into an idol? He will always seek to turn himself into an idol, and the image of the leader will become the image of the misleader. This is the leader who makes an idol of himself and of his office, and in this mocks God." And that's pretty powerful. If we think about that, even the people who have the best intentions, as they rise to superiority, as they rise in their leadership, as they gain more followers, they also can have a tendency to get more full of themselves, and can tend to think that everything kind of focuses around them. And when we do that, we kind of view ourselves as God. And as God is there to serve us. And I think back to, as we started Connection Christian Church, had I set out from day one with an amazing group of people that showed up in large numbers, I probably would have thought, wow, look what I did. And that would have been an epic fail. It really was through the growth, the ebbs and the flows, the struggles, the challenges, the joys and the frustrations, right? Where we've seen God bring the church. But in so much of this, it's like God is doing a work and I get to be a part of it, right? God is doing a work in your life and you get to be a part of it. The moment we start to think it's about us, or that we've somehow done something, then we have elevated ourselves to the position of God. And so that happened with King Saul. Kind of happened a little bit with David, only David realized and repented, right? But then we see this journey through the kings that we're going to go into. All of these people, they should have been there to point other people to a greater king, but in reality, they stepped out in wanting other people to worship them. And so we're up against this challenge, and I'm up against the challenge today that because Fernando was doing an update, I've got about 20 minutes, and I heard some people going, yeah, can he even do that in 20 minutes? And so I've got to prove some people wrong. And I like a good competition. So here we go. In this whole realm of things, we need to understand that God has blessed David. He wants to do great things through David. If we go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, David wants to build God a house, or a house for the Ark of the Covenant, which has all their religious artifacts, which was the semblance to the people of God's presence. But God says, thanks but no thanks. I'm going to build you a house. And when he said that, he was referring to a dynasty. I'm going to build a king and a kingdom that's going to be eternal. But David kind of screws it up, at least as it relates to his family. And then as he is punished by God, and the prophet Nathan speaks into his life, Nathan says, the sword will not pass from your home. Basically meaning, it's going to get worse with your kids. And it does. And so not only does David have his sin issues, even though he repents, he still has the consequences. And David has multiple wives and multiple children to those multiple wives. And one of his daughters is apparently really good looking. And one of his sons wants to be with his half-sister. And so he sexually assaults her. And then her brother is just kind of stewing on this thing for a couple of years before he actually takes the life of his own brother. And so we get to see Absalom murder Amnon. And this is David's family, and this is kind of what mess he's a part of now. And some of you know all too well, like the family drama that happens as a result of our sinful choices and the struggles that come with. Even if we've repented, even if we've gotten on a better track, like the ripple effects, the waves, the turbulence, like it still is at play in our life. So David had to deal with some of that. So Absalom, for a couple of years after the murder, he runs away. And then the leader of David's army says, hey, we need to bring him back. He is your son. So David relents. He brings in Absalom. But for a couple of years, he doesn't even talk to him. Of course, Absalom is like, what's the point? Like, I might as well not even be here. It's worse being here and not having no relationship. And so he's developing this deep animosity towards his dad who didn't punish his brother, who didn't vindicate his sister, and who is now holding him hostage, basically, but not talking to him. And so Absalom begins to plot and to plan kind of this takeover. It's a conspiracy to become king. And so he starts off like, hey, I'm gonna pay 50 guys to go with me. I'll have horses and a chariot, and we'll just cruise around the city like we own the place. And every time somebody comes in and they're seeking some wisdom from one of the judges of Israel, I'll cruise up there and say, hey, where are you from? What's your issue? Oh, sorry, the king, my dad, he doesn't have a judge in that area. But if I were to be king, I would take care of you. You see, he's pulling on the heartstrings of the people. He's manipulating them to move from King David to Absalom. And then later on, he's like, okay, Dad, David, I need to go worship God because I told him if he brought me back here, I'd go worship him. And he was playing that system too, right? I'm going to go to church so people think I look the part, but I've really got some hidden meaning, some hidden agenda going on here. And so he goes, but as he goes, he takes with him an entourage of about 200 people that are there to kind of set the stage. Like, hey, look at all these people who are already on my side. They're clueless, by the way. They don't know what Absalom is up to. He also sends out messengers into the countryside so that every time they heard the trumpet, then they could say, hey, Absalom is king. And all of this just like playing on the emotions of the people and building his own rebellion against King David, his dad. David hears about this, and in what seems like an uncharacteristic move, David flees. This is a far cry, at least in my opinion, of the David we saw in 1 Samuel chapter 17 when he was confronted with Goliath and he said, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he would come against our God that way? Right? And he was ready to take on a giant, but now his own son is making a play for the throne, and David just grabs his family and skips out of town. It seems a little odd to me. But David has a heart and a compassion. We can see that David is moved by his feelings. I mean, he is a man that wrote most of the Psalms. And you can see it play out even here at the end of 2 Samuel. The Lord is my rock and my refuge, right? He's where I run to when I'm in trouble. And when I feel like I'm drowning, he's the one that lifts me up. And he's got so much focus in on God and what God does for him. He's a feeler in some ways. And I think probably a thinker too, because he was a military strategist. There are a number of different personality profiles out there. One of the more popular ones is the Myers-Briggs. It's got 4 key metrics, but one of those metrics is, are you a thinker or are you a feeler? Right? And most people probably have a little bit of both. But where do you fit on that spectrum? How many of you would say, I am definitely more of a feeler? I'm not seeing a lot of hands. Does that mean that you're like still thinking about this? How many of you are thinkers? Right? I am a thinker. And when somebody says, well, how does that make you feel? I'm like, I don't feel anything. It just is. Right? Give me the facts. I want to know the facts. I want to process the facts and move on. Believe it or not, I'm married to a feeler. And this feeler wants to connect emotionally. And that oftentimes gets this guy in trouble. Because I'm like, what do you mean feel? We just do. And maybe you're kind of caught into that, but just as I look to David, I go, man, he's got the feels, right? He's in touch with that side of himself. And I struggle to be there. Matter of fact, I wrestled with feeling so much a year ago when we were getting ready to launch services at this location, and we'd gotten so much stuff built out, I was overwhelmed. Like I was just exhausted. And as we had the grand opening and everybody's coming in and they're excited and they get to see the building, I was like, man, I'm so over it. I'm just spent. And I walk in and I see the things that took a lot of work, and I see the things that aren't done yet. And it just kind of gave me a level of anxiety, and I'm not used to dealing with anxiety. I actually sought out a counselor that summer and said, hey, I don't know what's going on. Like, I've never felt this way before. I don't know what to do with this. And what he suggested to me is like, because you're not a feeler, because you don't like to deal with the emotions, like all of that stuff in your busyness got put on the back burner, and it all hit you at once, and it just overloaded your circuit board. And all of these feels actually caused you to shut down. I'm like, oh, yeah, I don't do feels. Right? But that journey of like seeking out help and trying to find like, how do I push through this? How do I move through this? And what does this look like? Well, David, like he lamented before God. He mourned before God. When people were against him, he had compassion on them. Think about the way that he treated Saul, who wanted to take his life. Like he still had compassion on the king, even though he was horrible, or at least treating him horribly. Right? He has now compassion on his son who's staging a revolt against him. Matter of fact, so much so that he tells when they go to battle, like, hey, let's win, but treat Absalom with care. So David has compassion. Well, the whole plot is going on. So Absalom, like he stages the coup inside of the city, right? Then he goes out to worship, but everybody's calling on him. His movement grows. He gets a guy who's a trusted advisor to David to join his side. Under the advice of this advisor, he actually sleeps with David's concubine, the people who are left behind to take care of his house. So concubines, if you're not familiar, those are people who have the duties of a wife without the privileges of a wife. Right? And he leaves 10 of them behind. And so Absalom puts a tent on top of the roof so everybody can know that he is making his play for the kingdom. And that his dad can do nothing about this. It was a massive insult to his father and to his father's kingdom. And yet David is tuck-tailed and run, right? Or at least it looks like that. David leaves with his family, but his family, if we dig into this, is way bigger than what it looks like, because later on it says that he appointed leaders of thousands and hundreds. So there was thousands of people that went with David, and it wasn't just his immediate family that went with. But they also took with them the Ark of the Covenant, which David sent back to town. He said, you know what? If God's going to give me the victory, he will bring me back into his presence. But right now, let's send it back. Let's send the priests back there too, so if anything happens, they can tell me what's going on. And I'm going to take my other advisor and I'm going to send him back, because if that advisor that is now with Absalom, if he goes against me, at least there will be a balance of power. There will be somebody to speak up. And in his wisdom, like that kind of happens. Absalom is ready to fight against David and all of his troops. And so the advisor that he is won to his side comes up with a plan. It's a great plan to annihilate David, but then David's advisor comes up with an even better plan to get David, only he shares the message so that David can find out. And then David's army is able to defeat Absalom's. And yet there's this one caveat: don't kill Absalom. Treat him with care. And then probably the coolest, craziest story in this whole thing is they're fighting, and Absalom is on a mule, and he runs into the forest, and he gets lodged into a tree, and his mule keeps on going, and he's just there stuck. I picture things in my head, and this is a funny picture. for sure. Like the fork of a tree, like, help, guys. David's army finds out about it, and remember, they're supposed to treat him nicely, and so nicely, the leader of his army thrusts 3 spears into his heart. Okay, maybe not so nicely. And then sends his armor bearers to finish the job. Absalom is eliminated as an enemy of the throne. But man, David is crushed. He mourns for the loss of his son. Now, I could go a lot of different directions with this, but I think it's important for us to try to figure out, like, what are some of the big takeaways from Samuel, 1st and 2nd, but also from this story. Right? There was a tension between David and Saul. They both failed. But what did they do when they failed? Saul just continued to go down the wrong path. He continued to revolt against God. David, however, repented and came back to God. But he still had to deal with the consequences. His family was a mess. His kingdom was a mess. There was division in the camp, without a doubt. And he had to endure all that. But he sought God. And then we have this tension between David and his son Absalom. Right? David was all about, like, I'm going to be patient. I'm going to trust God. And so even when Saul is chasing after me, I'm not going to rush it. I'm not going to disrespect the throne or the kingdom. Absalom didn't have those feelings. He resented his dad. He resented what his dad did. He was ready to eliminate his dad and all that his dad stood for his own cause. So as we deal with this tension, we need to understand that Absalom, man, he was a manipulator. Right? He was hurt because of the loss of his sister. He was hurt because of the lack of punishment. He was hurt because his dad didn't have a relationship with him, and he allowed that hurt to capture his heart. And he manipulated people for his own gain. And he even uses God. I'm going to go worship God. But it was never his intention really to worship God. But he just played the system. Right? And so who do we submit to? And David, he continued to submit to God even with all of his shortcomings. All of this kind of points us back to 1 Samuel. Hannah couldn't have a child. She prayed to God. She was blessed with a child. And she responds with a song in 1 Samuel chapter 2. And 3 main points to that song was, God is always at work despite the evil of humanity. Right? God is always at work despite how much I can screw things up in my own life and in the way that I am operating. God is always at work in your life, regardless of the mistakes and disappointments that you've made and been a part of. But God is opposed to the people who are proud, who are selfish, self-seeking, self-centered. But he gives grace to the humble. Whether that was Eli and his sons as priests, or Saul, or David, who humbled himself before God. Right? God is always opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And God will raise up a new king, a Messiah, the anointed Son of God, who we know as Jesus. Right? This is what's captured in Hannah's song, but it's also captured in the Song of David in 23 of 2 Samuel. And it's captured in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel whenever David is brought into this new lineage, this, I'm going to make a house for you, I'm going to make a kingdom. It's all pointing us to a greater king. Their rejection, Israel, of the king, God, led them in rebellion by pursuing after these kings that were mere men. And some of these mere men pointed to a greater king, and some of them pointed to themselves. And this is the rise and the fall that we see moving forward. The next series is called Pawns. Because if you're familiar with chess, there are kings and there are pawns. The pawns are many, and they have value, but they're not the king. You lose the king, you lose your life, right? You lose the game. And all of these kings that we encounter are merely pawns in the presence of the one true king. And this is what we get pointed to. And so we need to find out where we fit in this picture. And as is oftentimes the case, we draw ourselves in as the hero. Yes, I have so many enemies and they're chasing me and they're trying to capture me. They're trying to take away the things that are mine and I need to find a way to fight against that. But in reality, you and I are more accurately pictured as the rebellious son who is trying to make a coup for the kingdom. Right? Because we somehow got hurt and we think God should avenge our hurt in a way that makes us happy. Right? Which makes us king because God is serving us now. And so because of this hurt we've experienced, because of this loss in our life, we've allowed it to stew and to capture our heart. And in this hurt, we develop a resentment. And this resentment sends us on missions we have no business trying to take. And we're making a play for being charge of our life, for being God. Have no other gods, but we are the primary culprit in our life for the throne. But we need to see that Jesus and David, they have some similarities. Right? They were both betrayed by people they trusted. And they both wept over the people that betrayed them. Man, that's feels I'm not accustomed to. To be able to love people even when they've hurt me. But it kind of goes back to these words of David when he's confronted by a family member of Saul who is just constantly railing him. And he says, God will repay wrong and repay with good. If somebody is wrong, God will take care of it. And I need to trust that whatever wrong I've experienced, God will give me good. Because this is a huge statement that we all need to write into our heart. We need to know this, that God is a faithful and loving God. God wants us to move and act according to His purpose in submission to His throne, to walk in obedience, right? And we will get hurt by people who we think we can trust. It's guaranteed. Jesus talks about it. Jesus lived it. But He also extended grace and forgiveness, and He trusted that God would take care of the details. We need to trust that God will take care of the details. I'm going to give you 3 key questions to help you process this. And I'm not going to lie, they're pretty penetrating questions. The first one is this. How might you be manipulating other people for your own personal gain? How might you be manipulating other people for your own personal gain? It's easy to think, no, I'm good. Like I'm doing well. We are manipulators at our core because we're pretty self-seeking at our core. But God calls us to be selfless, to die to ourselves daily. So who in your life are you manipulating to try to get your way? To try to ease your pain, your hurt? The second question is this. Is there a loss or a hurt in your life that you need to mourn? Is there a loss or a hurt in your life that you need to mourn? Some of us are really good at just pretending like nothing happened, this guy, and moving on, without really mourning. Some of us, we go into the mourning, but we never really come out. Right? We're always stewing on the hurt or the loss, but we need to give that hurt or loss to God. Which then brings us to the third question. What hurt or loss do you need to turn over to God? What hurt or loss do you need to turn over to God? I'm going to read these again in case you're trying to write them down. They're also in the Notes app in the Church Center. How might you be manipulating other people for your own personal gain? Is there a loss or a hurt that you need to mourn? But I'm also going to challenge you that when you give it to God, that you can move on. Right? You don't have to keep stewing over a loss. I know it hurt. I know that you're hurt. But you need to give it to God and trust that He is going to provide the healing. That God is going to give the victory. That God is going to return evil for evil and good for good. And what past hurt do you need to turn over to God? Now, if you're dealing with these questions, we do have a couple of people that will be up front, and they would love to be able to pray for you and pray over you with whatever you're going through. Some of you simply for the first time, you just need to come up and you need to give it to God. Right? You've been holding on too long. And in Connection, we do full immersion baptism, which basically means that, hey, I've been going through some stuff and I realize that I don't measure up, but God is the King and I want to seek Him and I want Him to heal my life. I want Him to make me new. And if that's a decision that you want to make, we want to help you through that process, and we can do that today. We can usher you into the kingdom of God. But you have to decide, what are you waiting on? Is it really worth holding on to the hurt? Or are you ready to move forward and worship the one true King?